Hi, it's Katrina. The Lost Teachings of Christ. Some of the greatest biblical discoveries came in 1945. It wasn't the Dead Sea Scrolls, but an entirely different collection. It was a collection of ancient works found in the town of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. These scrolls turned out to be part of a spiritual library that had been sealed in secret deep in the Egyptian desert since 350 AD. The texts were stashed away by a community of Christians who believed they were following the true teachings of Jesus Christ. Some contain information about Jesus that nobody has heard of for over 1,600 years. One of the lost texts included the Gospel of Mary, which appears to suggest that Jesus Christ was married to Mary Magdalene. Then there's the first Apocalypse of James, which shows Jesus as a much more philosophical kind of guy than people give him credit for. In the Gospel, Jesus describes the pre-existence of the human soul, an idea rejected by most modern Christians. He talks a lot about the light of the Spirit, a higher consciousness, a higher self, and the greater total unity with all things. Jesus tells his brother James to free himself from the case of flesh which encircles him. There is another text called the Dialogue of the Savior. In it, one of the disciples asks Jesus, "Who is the one who seeks and who is the one who reveals?" Jesus answers, "The one who seeks is the one who reveals." The teachings we see preserved in the Nag Hammadi scrolls are a lot more similar to perhaps Buddhist or Hindu teachings than Christian. Jesus appears to be trying to show his followers that they are the Holy Spirit and that God lives within them as much as they live within him. The thing is, when the church became an institution, none of these texts were accepted. Horrific habits of Neolithic builders. The Neolithic builders of Stonehenge had a gruesome eating habit, one so disturbing you can understand why it's forbidden history. Scientists recently analyzed human waste discovered at a prehistoric village just outside Stonehenge. This may have been the very village where the builders of the Great Monument lived. Many generations of builders residing in the same peaceful hamlet in the ritual landscape of prehistoric Wiltshire. The study revealed evidence of parasitic worm eggs. In other words, the Neolithic builders were eating something that caused them to be infested with parasites. Scientists think they were eating raw cow guts. One of the lead authors of the study, Pierce Mitchell, said the parasites likely came from a winter feast during the construction of Stonehenge. It was common for the builders to gorge themselves during the winter months, likely eating whatever was handy. Based on the particular worm eggs, they were stuffing their faces on raw lungs, livers, and other organs from infected cows. This was during 2500 BC. When most of Stonehenge was completed. Big shout out to Sayamon and PJI. Thanks so much for watching and supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. We've got lots more videos like these coming up. Evil May Day. Evil May Day was one of the worst days in English history. It was the day xenophobic riots erupted in 1517, resulting in blood and chaos. There was a protest in London to remove all foreigners living in the city. Londoners grouped together, then violently attacked anyone they thought of as foreign. They beat the Flemish cobblers, savaged the French royal courtiers, and bludgeoned the foreign merchants. At this time, about 2% of the population in London was born outside England. It was the reign of King Henry VIII, and Londoners were starting to resent the strangers arriving in their land from the continent. Yes, it was ironic. The Londoners were largely descendants of the Normans from France, who invaded the lands of the Saxons, who themselves came from Germany, who had invaded the crumbling lands of the Romans, who of course invaded and took the land from the ancient tribes. But try explaining that to a London blacksmith angry about the immigrant Flemish workers in 1517. They'd probably hit you in the head too. A mob of over 1,000 angry men congregated in central London, freed a bunch of prisoners who had already gotten in trouble for attacking foreigners, and they rioted. They broke into the houses of rich foreigners and pillaged their stuff. Much of the anger was directed at French foreigners, coming with significant wealth when the people born in London slaved for a meager wage. In the end, the Duke of Norfolk entered London with his own private army and suppressed the riots. 300 people were arrested, and 13 were executed for treason. The Farmer and the Aliens. Antonio Vilas Boas was a Brazilian farmer in the 1950s who claimed to be abducted by aliens. Similar stories had been circulating in Brazil throughout the 1950s, but Antonio's story was the first to get any real attention. Some think the whole thing was a hoax, but Antonio stuck to his guns his entire life. He never once switched up the narrative, and he never admitted to lying. He said he was abducted all the way until his death in 1991. When the alleged abduction happened, Antonio was only 23 years old. He was working at night on his farm to avoid the brutal heat of the day. On October 15, 1957, he saw a red star appear in the sky. The star drew closer, shifted into an egg-shaped aircraft in the atmosphere, and then landed in the field with the farmer. It stood on 3 spindly metal legs, and Antonio ran for his life. He didn't get far, though. Antonio claimed he was grabbed by a humanoid in overalls and a helmet that made terrible barking sounds. 3 of its friends showed up, and together they dragged Antonio into their spaceship. The rest of his story involves being rubbed in gel, analyzed, suffocated with some kind of gas, and intergalactic breeding. Antonio said he was forced to procreate with one of the aliens before the humanoid beings let him off their ship. Antonio was labeled a lunatic by his friends and family. He did eventually get married and have 4 children, and he even became a lawyer, but the abduction thing forever followed him. When doctors tested Antonio after the bizarre event, it was found he had been exposed to a massive dose of radiation. Seeing as he'd never left his rural farm, there was never any other explanation for how he could have possibly contracted radiation sickness if his story wasn't at least partly true. Do you believe Antonio's story? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe while you're at it. The magic pendant. Magic was a very real thing in the ancient world. Whether it worked or not is a matter of speculation, but people truly did believe in the power of magic. Just recently, a metal detectorist uncovered an ancient magical pendant from the medieval days buried in Colchester, Essex. The pendant was found with the Hebrew phrase, "Thou art mighty forever, O Lord." Local expert Laurie Rogerson says the pendant was likely worn by a noble who was trying to invoke the power of God using Hebrew, which he must have thought was a magically powerful language. This was especially common in the 12th and 13th centuries. British nobles sought the power of magic to protect them and make them wealthy. For medieval Christians, Hebrew was the only language of magic. They saw Hebrew as an ancient and mysterious tongue, one that originated from a place of spells, legends, and lost mystical knowledge. Plenty of objects have been discovered from medieval England inscribed with magical Hebrew phrases. This was also a time when anti-Semitism was on the rise in England, resulting in the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. Hebrew went from being a mystical language used for protection to being the language of the devil. Public opinion changed very quickly. Black Jesus. Scholars are saying it's time to accept that Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord and Savior of the Christian religion, had black skin. Although he's often depicted as having long brown hair, pale skin, and looking very much anglicized, historians say Jesus Christ looked far more Middle Eastern. He was born, according to the Bible itself, in Israel. This means Jesus Christ would have looked just like his neighbors: dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. Richard Nieve from the University of Manchester has spent a significant amount of his own time trying to reconstruct the face of Jesus Christ. He uses forensic anthropology to come up with a physical description. Richard most recently gained a bit of fame for reconstructing the face of King Philip II of Macedonia. He was the father of Alexander the Great. To bring Jesus to life properly, Richard based his work only on the facts. He used the earliest known depictions of Christ found in and around Israel from the 1st century AD. He also used preserved Israeli skulls from the 1st century. All his scientific work shows Jesus had extremely dark skin, almost black. He had short black hair, a huge nose, full lips, and a stubbly black beard. Jesus Christ only became depicted in the way we see him today in the 3rd century thanks to Emperor Constantine. He changed the images of Jesus of Nazareth to a white guy with a long chestnut beard to make him appeal more to Europeans. After all, remember, he was trying to convert everyone. Amazonian Stonehenge. Scientists have found proof that an advanced civilization lived in Brazil 500 years before the Spanish began to colonize the Americas. The natives of the Brazilian Amazon were creating huge blocks of granite as part of an ancient jungle Stonehenge way before Europeans showed up. The proof comes from the Reggio Grande site, dubbed the Amazonian Stonehenge. Scientists recently investigated the site's 127 blocks of granite, each one around 13 feet tall, comprising a circle 100 feet in diameter. Reggio Grande appears to have been built 1,000 years ago by an unknown people living deep in the jungle. They built the vast stone circle at the top of a hill, perhaps for astronomical purposes. Experts guess the tropical Stonehenge was used by ancient astronomers to map the cosmos. They most likely didn't travel to space, but they hung around in their great stone observatory and watched how the stars and planets moved. If true, they would have had extensive knowledge of the universe, an impressive feat for people who lived underneath the perpetual dark of the jungle canopy. Still, there is a lot to learn about Reggio Grande. Mariana Cabral from the Federal University of Minas Gerais has been studying the site for years and calls it infinitely fascinating. She's also explored other megalithic sites in the area that may have been markers for ancient huntsmen. More evidence is needed before we turn Reggio Grande into the Amazonian Stonehenge. Nobody knows when the place was built, who built it, or where the builders went and why they abandoned their observatory. Do you have any theories? Let me know in the comments. The Kingdom of Gewiss. Starting in the 5th century AD, after the fall of Roman Britain, the mysterious Kingdom of Gewiss rose to rule a huge part of the UK for 200 years. They forged a new identity for the British in the aftermath of the Roman destruction. It all started with a Germanic invader named Cerdic, but because this was the 5th century, the beginning of the Dark Ages, not much is known about this time. The Kingdom of Gewiss is part myth and part history. The first ruler of the Gewiss was Cerdic. He arrived in Britain in 495 with a small fleet of ships. In 508, he fought against the indigenous British ruler named Natanliod. For the next few decades, Cerdic went about establishing the Kingdom of Southern Britain. The issue most historians have is that there is very little evidence Cerdic ever existed. Germanic settlements discovered from the 6th and 7th centuries have been used to assume that the Gewiss was founded by Germanic mercenaries. Nobody really knows where they came from. By the 8th century, the Gewiss had massacred most of their rivals and established the Kingdom of Wessex. They became known as the Saxons and only lost their power during the Norman conquest, when the descendants of the Vikings took over England. The Ice Age Code. In 2007, Genevieve von Petzinger set out to study geometric rock art found painted or carved on the walls of caves and rock shelters across the world during the Stone Age. Genevieve traveled across the globe and documented as many ancient sites as she could find. She was shocked to notice eerie similarities between geometric signs found in caves all over the world starting 40,000 years ago. She believes early human beings had a communication system dating way back to before the first written language of the Sumerians. Her findings suggest human beings communicated with the same geometric patterns regardless of where they lived in the world. It was an ancient universal language, but where in the universe did it come from? Genevieve found approximately 32 geometric signs spread across 30,000 years of cave art in Europe. She claims if these were random doodles, you would expect to see significantly more variation. Instead, we see the same exact signs representing what? Was this a language? Was it a means of communicating events? Scientists don't have an answer. All we know is that these signs repeat in most Stone Age caves, and about 65% of them remained in use up until the dawn of civilization. Genevieve compared these symbols to the emojis of today. The Library of Pergamon. The Library of Pergamon was established in the city of the same name 2,200 years ago. King Eumenes II of the Attalid Empire was the man behind its construction during his reign between 197 and 159 BC. The library grew to be the most well-respected center of learning and repository of knowledge in Turkey. The Library of Alexandria in Egypt likely contained more volumes and was more famous. At its height, the Library of Pergamon had an estimated 200,000 books, mostly written on parchment. A rivalry between Pergamon and Alexandria led to both institutions trying to acquire as much knowledge as possible, filling their shelves with books. But just like the Library of Alexandria, the library in Pergamon wouldn't last forever. The kingdom of Pergamon was assimilated into the Roman Republic around 100 BC. The Romans continued to maintain the library up until things started to go wrong 60 years later. Mark Antony allegedly handed over the entire collection of the fabled library over to his lover Cleopatra. It was supposedly emptied and transferred to the Library of Alexandria in 43 BC. This means whatever forbidden knowledge or sacred wisdom was held in the library was lost with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. The one in Pergamon continued to exist during the early years of the Byzantine Empire, but the collection was a sad shadow of its former self. By 1100, the city of Pergamon was abandoned.
A baffling burial. In Portugal, archaeologists found the ancient burial of a child. The burial is so outrageously bizarre that scientists can't quite understand it. The child was found buried underneath the historical town of Silves, alongside a donkey, goat, cat, horse, and bird. The skeletons were stacked on top of each other like a tower of the dead. The discovery came in 2017 during urban rehabilitation work. Archaeologists have dated the child back to the 13th century AD, a time when Muslim rule over this part of Spain was coming to a harsh end. The kid's skeleton was at the bottom of the bone pile, buried underneath all the other creatures. But the pit in which the kid was found was also full of ancient weapons, leading researchers to speculate the child's death was an accident. The child may have been accidentally slain during violence that unfolded during the reconquest of Silves, then was buried along with other animals that became casualties of war. Whoever this poor child was, their burial was a mess. Everything was just tossed in there. Even the horse that was discovered on top was thrown haphazardly into the pit, since it was still wearing its horseshoes. Chamunda. Chamunda is a fearsome Hindu mother goddess, one of 7 mother goddesses and chief of the 81 tantric goddesses. She is only one goddess out of hundreds in ancient Hindu mythology, something so much more complex than the mythologies of the Romans and Greeks. To put things as simply as possible, Chamunda is most closely associated with epidemics of pestilence, disaster, and famine, and she's the Hindu goddess of war. In ancient times, Chamunda was worshipped fervently. Researchers believe she may have begun as a tribal goddess worshipped by primitive mountain dwellers in central India. These tribes offered Chamunda sacrifices, either human or animal, and gave her ritual offerings of liquor. Chamunda would eventually be absorbed into Hinduism, and many of her original methods of worship survived. But rather than sacrificing humans to the goddess of war, Hindus would sacrifice certain animals in dark underground rituals. Chamunda's depictions are utterly ghoulish. Examples of Chamunda in artwork as far back as the 11th century show her in a frightening light. She is often depicted wearing a garland of severed heads or skulls. She has up to 12 arms, wielding everything from a snake to a sword, a skull mace to a thunderbolt, and even a trident. Images of Chamunda also show her standing on a pile of corpses, surrounded by jackals dripping blood from their mouths. Everything about her is disturbing. Then there are her veins, seen in statues pulsing with blood as if she is the goddess of death itself. Ancient amputation. 31,000 years ago, prehistoric hunters on the island of Borneo carried out complex surgeries. The oldest known amputation was recently discovered in Borneo, with the surgery taking place inside the darkness of a wet jungle cave. Then again, it may have been done just outside the cave so that the surgeon could see what they were doing. The young patient may have been completely aware while their left leg was surgically removed. Or they may have been intoxicated, thanks to a natural concoction of plants and ingredients from the forest. The surgery itself was carried out using sharpened rocks. If that sounds horrific to you, that's because it was. Imagine if you had an infection in your left leg and had to get it amputated. It would be a frightening situation. Now imagine you had to do it while fully awake and the doctor was going to use a rock. It's difficult to comprehend just how frightened the young victim was during the operation. The good news is that it was a massive success. Archaeologists working in this remote part of Indonesia discovered the skeletal remains of the amputee. They could see clearly by the healing marks that the surgery had gone well. The victim survived many years after having their leg removed. It came as a huge shock because the surgical operation happened 7,000 years earlier than the next known oldest surgery BC, which was 24,000 years ago. Years and years before the rise of early civilizations, humans had already mastered medicine, performing extreme surgeries with nothing but stones and plants. The Inverted Temple. Rani Ki Vav is the Inverted Temple of India, an astounding subterranean building designed centuries ago for storing massive amounts of water. The Inverted Temple is known as a stepwell, or the Queen's Stepwell specifically. It was made about 1,000 years ago as a Hindu temple containing fabulous works of art, and also used to supply fresh water to the locals and to help irrigate the land. The mysterious structure was built on the edge of the Saraswati River in the 11th century AD. At that time, this part of Western India was ruled by the Chalukyas dynasty. Queen Udayamati built the stepwell in memory of her deceased husband, Bhima I. The physical creation of the stepwell must have been an enormous undertaking. Workers had to dig a huge pit in the earth 100 feet deep, 213 feet wide, and 66 feet long. Then they had to build the stone temple. It was completed with 7 levels of stairs leading down to a well at the very bottom. At every level can be found stepped corridors and pavilions where locals once gathered to drink fresh water and socialize with their friends. There are over 200 pillars within the Inverted Temple, and hundreds of more carvings and inscriptions, sculptures of gods and goddesses, and depictions of the vast Hindu spirit realm. The Inverted Temple worked by collecting groundwater and rainwater. During the monsoon season, the temple would fill to the brim with water. This water was clean and fresh, and so people could use it throughout the year. But centuries later, the weather started to change. The nearby river flooded, and the temple was completely buried. It was discovered by amateur explorers in the 1940s, fully buried under mud. A big shout out to Amable Oreo and Isaac Brill. Thanks so much for watching and supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The history of the Burnt City. The Burnt City is one of the most mesmerizing ancient sites in the Middle East. It also happens to be one of the largest destroyed Bronze Age cities in Iran. Many believe it was the capital of an unknown ancient civilization that appeared 5,200 years ago. Carbon dating of charcoal found in the hearths of destroyed houses within this city suggests it was occupied at least as recently as 4,800 years ago. The Burnt City covers an astounding area of 200 hectares. Archaeologists have linked it to the legendary city of Arata, which appears in ancient Sumerian poems as the place where the sun rises. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the city was said to be extremely difficult to reach, yet rich in gold, silver, and other exotic materials. There was supposedly a temple built from solid lapis lazuli dedicated to the goddess Inanna. But what does the archaeological evidence tell us? We know the Burnt City was a major trading center in Mesopotamia. It was also home to one of the first complex societies in Iran. The city burned down 3 times, hence the name, and was rebuilt up until the last fire in 1800 BC. Despite multiple excavations, numerous studies, and a lot of speculation, we don't know much about the place. This city is a complete mystery, with experts not even knowing who lived within its walls or why it burnt down so frequently. Do you have any theories? Ireland's secret treasure. You won't find Derrynaflin on any tourist maps. The 44-acre Irish island is privately owned, and it's not like any island you've ever seen before. It isn't surrounded by ocean waves, it's not at the center of a lake, and instead the island is in the middle of a swampy peatland. It can often be seen through the rising fog of early morning like a green mirage. The island is smack dab in the middle of a remote bogland where some of the earliest Irish monks sought solitude in the 6th century. While the majority of Europe was in disarray following the drama at the end of the Roman Empire, Irish scholars were living a life of peace. Rome and its destruction and the Dark Ages that followed were a long way from Derrynaflin and the peat bog. In fact, you might consider Ireland as experiencing a kind of golden age, especially in terms of artistic achievements. The monastic settlements like the one at Derrynaflin were behind some great scholarly advances, but it's here where one of the most exciting archaeological discoveries discoveries was made decades ago. A farmer in 1980 unearthed a cup and plate with a metal detector. The cup was a chalice from the 9th century, and the plate was used during the Eucharist in the 8th century at a medieval church. The artifacts were confirmed by archaeologists at the National Museum of Ireland to be legit, real religious relics from a bygone age. The artifacts are now some of the most magnificent examples of Celtic goldsmithing. Under the peat and hiding in the swamp around Derrynaflin are undoubtedly more exciting discoveries just waiting to be found. The new Moai. An entirely new statue has been found on Rapa Nui, more popularly known as Easter Island. The sacred monument, called a moai, was discovered buried underneath a lake bed that had gone dry recently. During unexpectedly hot weather conditions, with Easter Island receiving very little rain, the lake completely dried up. Archaeologists thought it might be a good time to see if there was anything hiding underneath. Sure enough, they found the remains of a never-before-seen moai, nearly identical to the other 1,000 statues across the island. What a lot of people don't realize is that even though the moai statues look the same, they vary greatly in size. The biggest is about 33 feet tall and weighs upwards of 80 tons, but the vast majority only weigh 3 to 5 tons. The newest moai discovered is one of the smaller of the island statues, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Salvador Atanhito, who oversees the island's national park on behalf of the indigenous Rapa Nui people, called it an important discovery. It also appears to be exceptionally old. Salvador says not even the ancestors of those still living on the island, their own grandparents, had any idea there were lost statues underneath the lake. This could open the door for even more shocking discoveries on one of the world's most mysterious islands. The Skull Comb. Archaeologists found a strange and very rare artifact in England recently. The artifact is a little gruesome, but very fascinating. It's a comb that was crafted from a real human skull. The disturbing relic was found at a site near Cambridge University. According to the Museum of London Archaeology, the comb could shed light on previously unknown cultural practices carried out in the Iron Age. That was between 750 BC and 43 AD. In the 8th centuries before the arrival of the Romans, Britain was occupied by warring tribes. These tribes lived in hilltop fortresses, settlements with tall wooden walls, and were almost constantly fighting. It seems like there would have been little time for brushing one's hair. And yet here we have a bone comb, crafted from somebody's head. It's clearly a comb because it has about a dozen teeth skillfully carved that wouldn't have been good for much else. It was found in the same area where researchers uncovered tools made from human leg and arm bones. All these gruesome instruments have been found near Cambridge, indicating there may have been an isolated tribe who had a thing for arts and crafts using human remains. Chambers under the Western Wall. A secret was recently discovered near Jerusalem's Western Wall. Archaeologists uncovered previously concealed subterranean chambers. These rooms spent 1,400 years in darkness, obscured underneath the floor of a Byzantine-era building. According to the Associated Press, the mysterious subterranean chambers were found 120 feet from Temple Mount, the holiest site on earth for Jews and Muslims. The compound of the Temple Mount contains such structures as Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Western Wall. Beneath these religious sanctuaries is an unseen world. Archaeologists only revealed a piece of it, finding a handful of rooms cut into the very bedrock of the site. Each room is connected by a carved staircase, and the hallways have carved niches likely used as storage spaces. These subterranean corridors and rooms were created about 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists believe the network was at the city's civic center. The main public street would have passed by just a few feet away, with a bridge nearby connecting the upper city to the temple. In other words, the secret chambers are merely forgotten remnants of ancient Jerusalem, as it was prior to the Roman invasion of 70 AD. This was part of the original city, which was eventually buried as Jerusalem grew. The new city was built over the bones of the oldest Hebrew Bible. The Codex Sassoon is believed to be the earliest Hebrew Bible known to science. It was written in the late 9th century or early 10th century, with its value currently placed at around $50 million. Sharon Mintz, senior specialist with Sotheby, called it the most important document she ever had the pleasure of examining and researching. The Hebrew Bible is the foundation for the three major Abrahamic faiths of today, including Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Judaism came first with the Hebrew Bible, Christianity arose after Jesus Christ died around 30 AD, and then Islam came about 600 years later with the Prophet Muhammad. But it all started with the Hebrew Bible, which began to be written around 1200 BC. It was fully completed in the current state it is now by about 200 years after the death of Christ. But how can a book from 1,000 years ago be the earliest Hebrew Bible if the Hebrew Bible began to be authored 3,200 years ago? This is an important question with an easy answer. Prior to the 9th century, biblical texts only existed in scroll form. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't contain chapters or verses or even punctuation. The entirety of the Hebrew Bible was written down on loose scrolls and clay tablets. The Codex Sassoon is the oldest known example of the Hebrew Bible in physical book form. As for where it came from, that's a bit more of a mystery. It was acquired by a man named Sassoon, who acquired it from somebody else, and so on and so forth, back 1,000 years. Horror at Notre Dame. When the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris burst into flames in 2019, it was absolutely devastating. Everyone around the world was shocked, and the French feared the ancient building would be damaged beyond repair. However, when archaeologists entered the cathedral the next day to survey the damage, they found something shocking. The devastation had opened up a hole in the bottom of the building. Archaeologists then excavated an area of exposed flooring and found historical artifacts. Not just a few old relics from the Middle Ages either. They found painted sculptures, a chunk of fence from the 13th century, a collection of tombs, and two mysterious sarcophagi. One of the tombs held a human-shaped coffin built out of solid lead, and experts believe it was buried underneath the floor of the cathedral in the 14th century. Not wanting to damage the human remains by opening the sarcophagus, archaeologists inserted a small endoscopic camera through a crack in the funerary box. According to Christophe Besnier with the French National Archaeological Institute, they could clearly see cloth remains, hair, and even what appeared to be plant elements. The sarcophagus was recently opened by researchers who were able to identify the remains as belonging to a man between the ages of 25 and 40. He seems to have been a horseback rider based on a study that looked at his pelvic bones. He was also buried with a crown of flowers and appears to have died from tuberculosis. The Hongshan culture. Recent excavations in China have revealed some new insights into the ancient Hongshan culture, a group of Neolithic people who originated in northeast China. The Hongshan are most notable today for their impressive work with jade. About 6,500 years ago, they were mining the raw jade and turning it into fantastic artifacts and beautiful works of art. The Hongshan lasted about 1,500 years before suddenly vanishing from the archaeological record. Recently, Chinese researchers excavated a huge settlement built by these people, along with many smaller sites. They also found the remains of grains, buildings that may have been used for ritual sacrifices, and agricultural tools. It's amazing to see that in prehistoric times, early Chinese cultures were just as obsessed with dark rituals as their counterparts in Europe. The new excavations have revealed that near the end of the Hongshan's dominance in the region, they began building temples, massive altars, and what appear to be huge burial mounds. Researchers aren't exactly sure what happened, but the Hongshan may have experienced some kind of religious awakening. What we do know is that they worshipped a mother goddess. One of the most important places ever found in China is the Goddess Temple. It was built by the Hongshan culture roughly 5,000 years ago. Inside, archaeologists found immense clay figurines that were over 3 times larger than real humans. This was a monumental building that can be compared to the Temple of Zeus in Greece, only it was built thousands of years earlier. It's shout-out time! I wanted to say a big thank you to Chelsea Wilson and Cam717. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. We really appreciate the feedback. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Embalming chemicals. Ancient Egyptian embalmers had access to surprisingly sophisticated chemicals. Pots were recently found in an embalming workshop that was used 2,500 years ago to make mummies. Researchers investigated the pots and found them to contain the extracts of plants and animals. These extracts were critical in the creation of preserved human remains. What really surprised researchers was that many of the ingredients came from thousands of miles away. This wasn't a sloppy operation with random workers wrapping mummies in bandages. This was very serious business, involving a necessary understanding of anatomy, a little bit of alchemy, and rare substances from as far as Southeast Asia. Prior to these recent finds, most of what we know about the mummification process came from historical texts and the analysis of mummies. But being able to look inside the physical jars used to hold the materials is something truly special. The workshop was found in Egypt's Saqqara necropolis, an ancient cemetery that was used to bury the dead starting around 2600 BC. The workshop was installed about 2,000 years later, around 600 BC. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of the workshop found ceramic vessels, and many of them were labeled. They didn't even have to do chemical analysis on a lot of the jars because they had the contents written right on them. Extracts came from cypress and cedar trees as well as juniper bushes, all of which can be found around the Mediterranean. However, the team also found bitumen from the Dead Sea in Israel. Locally produced animal fats and beeswax were regularly incorporated into balms as well. But by far the most shocking substance found at the embalming workshop is called damar, which comes from sharia trees that are native to southern India and Sri Lanka. It's too bad not all ancient civilizations were as organized as the Egyptians. A Neanderthal feast. In a dark and spooky cave in Brazil, archaeologists recently discovered the remains of a Neanderthal feast. If you've ever wondered what was on the dinner menu for Neanderthals 90,000 years ago, you're in for a real treat. Based on the charred remains of shell fragments that were found by archaeologists, a group of prehistoric human ancestors once sat down in the Figueira Brava cave and enjoyed a monumental feast of brown crab. The author of the study, Mariana Nabais, says the animals were brought whole to the cave, possibly alive, and were then roasted on coals before getting consumed. Just like modern people today, Neanderthals apparently had a weak spot for shellfish. But that's not all the study revealed. Researchers say the Neanderthals even consumed their crab just like we do. They looked at damage patterns on the ancient shells and found consistencies with the way people crack open their crustaceans at modern dinner tables. The brown crab is still a popular meal in Western Europe, specifically in Portugal, Spain, and France. The truly crazy part about this discovery is that the sudden obsession with eating crab may have helped humans get smarter. Scientists have theorized that the consumption of seafood promoted brain growth in early Homo sapiens. All those omega-3 fatty acids helped to develop incredible cognitive abilities. This may have given early humans a competitive advantage over other species of hominids like Neanderthals. Why exactly the Neanderthals didn't get the same brain boost from their crabs is still a bit of a mystery, but it could be that they just didn't eat enough crab to grow their brains. Mystery at Chichen Itza. At one of Mexico's most photographed archaeological sites, researchers have discovered something completely new. Archaeologists were doing research at the famous Chichen Itza when they found a group of never-before-seen structures. These constructions were likely part of a housing complex inhabited by elite members of Maya society. The aristocrats in the 5th century AD may have been living in these residences. Archaeologists say this is the first residential district found in Chichen Itza, where a ruler lived with his entire extended family. Would you want to live with your extended family? Or do you? Let me know in the comments. The newly found buildings aren't part of the visitor area at Chichen Itza, but just outside of it, where researchers can do their work in peace. The complex includes a pair of massive houses called the House of the Snails and the House of the Moon. But there is also another building that's referred to as the Palace of the Phalluses. Archaeologist José Osorio León says there must be other residential areas that have yet to be found. José believes that if researchers can track down more elite residential groups, they'll be able to learn more about the major families that once controlled the city. It's amazing to think that new discoveries are still being made here since Chichen Itza has been investigated non-stop since 1998. Have you ever been to Chichen Itza? Is it on your bucket list? Let me know in the comments. Ghoulish medieval remains. The University of Sheffield in England recently announced the discovery of some ghoulish medieval human remains. They identified the remains as being from a woman who was being stored in the collections at the college. She was originally found in 2007, buried underneath the foundations of the All Saints Church. She'd been buried in a crouched position, almost as if she was hugging her knees while being covered in dirt. After her remains were discovered, she was taken back to the university to be studied. So much for resting in peace. It's only just recently that archaeologists were able to identify her as Lady Isabel German. Historical records from the 15th century show that she chose to live a life of prayer in seclusion just like a monk. 500 years ago, this woman lived in a single room at the church, which is located in Fishergate, York. Researchers wanted to learn how and why she died. Analysis of her skeleton revealed that she suffered from septic arthritis, as well as an advanced form of venereal syphilis. This was a terrible disease frequently transmitted through intimate physical contact in the Middle Ages. It's a bit of a mystery because researchers aren't sure how she could have contracted such a thing if she was living the life of an isolated monk. Researcher Lauren McIntyre says Lady Isabel German would have been seen as a significant figure because of her chosen lifestyle. The local community likely would have treated her like a living prophet, and yet she was ravaged by syphilis to such a point that it killed her. Stewartstown. Archaeologists with the University of South Carolina may have just discovered evidence of a Scottish settlement in Beaufort, South Carolina. The settlement was called Stewartstown, and it was founded in the 17th century, but shortly after, it was lost to time. Historians have always known such a place existed, but modern archaeologists have never been able to pinpoint its exact location. Most researchers believed it to be buried somewhere in Beaufort's Spanish Point neighborhood, not far from the Beaufort River. But until recently, no remnants of the settlement were found there. Archaeologists, with help from locals at the First African Baptist Church, began combing through people's backyards a few miles upriver. They were looking for any evidence of human habitation prior to the modern houses. In early 2023, the unusual urban excavation turned up exactly what they were hoping to find. The team found shards of 17th century pottery scattered across 11 residential properties. Lead archaeologist Chester DePrater says we can now conclusively say that Stewartstown is hidden underneath Beaufort. The town is legendary for its horrifying history. In 1684, 51 Presbyterian Scots fled England and landed in South Carolina, which is when they built the quaint settlement of Stewartstown. 2 years later, it was burned to the ground by Spanish and Native American troops. It was revenge for the role the Scots played in a slave raid. The attack drove away the Pilgrims, and their settlement was lost until now. Giant cryosphinxes. There are two ancient temples in the Egyptian city of Luxor that are unlike anything else on the planet. The Luxor Temple and the Karnak Temple can be found here, separated by 1.7 miles. Joining these two temples is something called the Avenue of Sphinxes, otherwise known as the King's Festivities Road. When the most recent work was finished on the avenue about 2,300 years ago, it consisted of over 1,000 sphinxes and statues on either side of the pathway. It would have been something truly mind-blowing to see. Egyptian priests led sacred processions along the avenue during the most important festivals and ceremonies. Recently, researchers found 3 new sphinxes just outside Karnak Temple. However, these aren't any ordinary sphinxes. They are called cryosphinxes. Instead of having the body of a lion and the face of a pharaoh, these statues have the bodies of lions and the heads of rams. One of them was even found to have a coiled cobra carved onto the top of its head, and another one had a hieroglyphic inscription from the reign of Amenhotep III, the grandfather of King Tutankhamun. That means the cryosphinxes may have been some of the earliest statues erected alongside the sacred pathway, created sometime around the year 1390 BC. The Avenue of Sphinxes was constructed during the 18th dynasty from between 1550 to 1295 BC, and it continued to be used until the Ptolemaic dynasty in 305 BC. What really has archaeologists scratching their heads, though, is that nobody really knows what the purpose of cryosphinxes was. Others have been found at the entrance of the Temple of Amun in Thebes. But again, we don't have any clue what the point of them was. Even stranger is the carving of the cobra on the Sphinx's head. Surely that means something, but researchers just haven't figured it out yet. Roman floor mosaic. On the coast of Naples, archaeologists were recently performing excavations at an ancient luxury seaside villa. The villa belonged to one of the most horrific figures from Roman history, a tyrant known as Publius Vettius Pollio. This man went down in history for being particularly cruel to his slaves. According to legend, he liked to torture his servants by feeding them parasitic worms and doing other bizarre experiments on them. He lived on the Bay of Naples 2,000 years ago in an exclusive neighborhood reserved for the wealthiest Roman families. While archaeologists were excavating the ruins of his fancy house, they found a breathtaking floor mosaic. Researchers from the University of Naples said the mosaic was found in a living room with a wide-open view of the sea. The floor was made from small white pieces of a material called tesserae, which is sort of like glass or ceramic. The mosaic likely dates back to the Republican age, before the Roman Empire was formed. After the death of the terrible tyrant Publius, the mosaic was buried under renovation work. Emperor Augustus took over the villa and had the floor covered up. At the moment, we don't know what the mosaic depicted. It could have been a picture of magical nymphs, or perhaps something far more sinister. Golden glass. When the Romans wanted to personify the eternal city, they turned Rome into a woman named Roma. She was portrayed wearing a helmet and she carried a war spear in her hand. During recent work on a subway line in Rome, workers uncovered a rare piece of golden glass depicting one such image. The glass is ancient, likely dating back around 1,600 years to the 4th century AD. It's an incredibly rare piece showing Roma, the city of Rome in human form, as a battle-hardened warrior woman. Archaeologist Simona Moretta says the piece was likely the bottom of a cup. This was a drinking vessel that an ancient Roman resident had used in their everyday life. When they took a sip from the cup, they were staring at the face of their beloved city. Then, when the cup was shattered, most likely by accident, the owner saved the image because they liked it. Simona says she wouldn't be surprised if the image had been hung on the wall as a piece of decor. The fortified city of Carcassonne. One of the most amazing fortifications in all of Europe is the fortified city of Carcassonne. This place has been standing in the misty hills of rural France since the Roman age. The fortress began as a small settlement with high wooden walls. Then, in the medieval days, the settlement grew into a fortified town. Huge defensive walls were built around the central castle, and its streets soon found themselves protected by ramparts and towers. It's one of the most exceptional examples of Gothic architecture in the world, with truly ancient city streets, narrow footpaths, stone bridges, and secret dungeons. Carcassonne is not just a castle, not just a fortification, but a full medieval city perfectly preserved. Some scientists even believe Carcassonne has been inhabited since the Neolithic era around 3,500 BC. People may have been living here in crude shacks at the end of the Stone Age. It became an important place of trade for the Romans, who used the high vantage of the hilltop where the city stands to keep an eye on the land surrounding them. After the fall of the Romans, the Visigoths took over and established Carcassonne as a major city in the Visigothic kingdom. In 1659, changes to the way things were being done in Europe caused the city's military significance to be reduced. The fortifications were abandoned, and the city began to function strictly as an economic center. It grew powerful in the textile industry and was home to merchants and workers up until the market collapsed in the 18th century. It was later refurbished in the 19th century, and discoveries at the site are still being made. Have you ever been there? Do you recommend it? Let us all know in the comments below. An ancient Egyptian spellbook. In shocking recent news, an ancient Egyptian spellbook has been translated for the first time. The spellbook was made an estimated 1,300 years ago by a group of Christian and Scythian Egyptians. This group recorded a catalog of rituals, spells, and other incantations that could be used to fix a demonic possession. In other words, to perform an exorcism. The book also contained spells and rituals designed to cure ailments, force people to fall in love, and bring great success to any business endeavor. All of these fantastic spells, which would be very useful if they worked, were written down on a huge piece of papyrus using the Coptic language. And now, the spells have been translated. The discovery of the text happened 4 decades ago in 1981. It was uncovered in a collection of ancient papyrus held at the Macquarie University in Sydney. It's not clear where exactly it came from, but wound up stored at the university. It's likely that an explorer in the 19th century brought it back from Egypt, or maybe even purchased it from a market somewhere. Either way, the text is authentic. But as for the spells that have been translated, it's hard to say if they ever truly worked. One of the magic formulas was to recite a spell over a pair of nails, then drive those nails into the doorpost of someone you wanted to control. When that person wakes up the next day, they will suddenly feel the need to do your bidding. Are you brave enough to try any of these spells? Let me know in the comments. A strange insignia on Mars. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter recently captured a shocking image of something on the red planet. Ever since the orbiter was launched in 2005, it has been sending back all kinds of exciting photographs from Mars. But this newest image has been blowing people's minds. It appears someone may have landed on Mars in the very distant past, and they left behind an unexpected piece of modern pop culture. The high-rise, high-resolution camera picked up what appears to be a natural dune formation on the surface of the planet. The dune is shaped like the Starfleet insignia from the TV show Star Trek. Even if you're not a big fan of the show, you can appreciate the bizarre coincidence. The sand dune and the popular symbol look identical. It looks like somebody stamped the Starfleet symbol onto the Martian surface. And while it's unlikely Captain Kirk got to Mars before any of us, it's still pretty cool. In all likelihood, the strange insignia was made by forces of nature. Ross Beyer from the SETI Institute explained the insignia as scientifically as possible. He says that a very long time ago, there was a sand dune moving across the area. Then there was an eruption and lava flowed over the sand and around the dune, solidifying the dune into a misshapen island. It just so happens the solidified sand looks exactly like something from one of the most famous sci-fi franchises on Earth. Any Star Trek fans out there? What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments. It's shout-out time! Big thank you to Nick Singh for supporting this channel. We really appreciate the super thanks. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Mass mobilization. Scientists have uncovered something amazing using the newest scientific technology in the field of archaeology. Scientists used LiDAR laser technology to reveal a Mayan landscape in the Guatemalan rainforest over 2,000 years old. While you may have heard of this discovery before, since it's been in the news frequently, you may not know all the details. Yes, the discovery did reveal over 1,000 settlements, an entire world of lost Mayan heritage. But it also showed for the first time just how much work was required to keep the Maya civilization afloat. Carlos Morales Aguilar from the University of Texas says this is the first discovery in which we can see the entire landscape of a Mayan region. What this suggests is that the Maya needed mass mobilization of laborers and workers. They also needed specialists and scientists. To have over 1,000 settlements connected by an estimated 100 miles of roadways, a lot of civil engineering needed to happen. There had to be assembly line workers, line producers, quarry specialists, architects, and religious officials, even legal enforcement agents from the government. This was an extremely complex society. These kinds of building projects don't happen without supervision and skilled workers from every kind of industry. The lost settlements and pyramids are certainly exciting, but one of the most fascinating parts of the discovery is understanding just how much work went into maintaining the Maya Empire. Ancient Roman brain cells. Archaeologists discovered the preserved brain cells of one of the victims of the Mount Vesuvius eruption from 79 AD. This was the volcanic eruption that left the Roman city of Pompeii covered in hot ash. What a lot of people don't know is that there was a second city called Herculaneum that also got hit with scorching hot ash. Hundreds of residents were burned alive as they desperately ran from their homes. Archaeologists have discovered the remains of victims who were cooked alive as they tried to escape the explosion. These victims were hit by such an intense wave of heat that their blood boiled and their skulls exploded. One of these victims was a man in his 20s, found still lying in his bed. Researchers think he may have worked as a guard at the nearby college. He was likely asleep when the eruption happened and was cooked in his own bed. Now, scientists have found shards of black matter inside his remains. They believe the pieces of matter are scraps of his brain. When they scanned the scraps using electron microscopy, they identified them as brain cells. The scientific team behind the discovery believes this is now the best example of ancient preserved brain tissue. It's all thanks to the heat. Scorching volcanic ash, followed by a sudden and rapid drop in temperature, caused the man's brain to turn to glass, then shatter like fine crystal. A pyramid on the moon. A pyramid structure has just been found on the surface of the moon. Yep, a pyramid on the moon. It appears to be either evidence of a forgotten alien structure or evidence of overexcited human imagination. Evidence of the alien pyramid was found on Google Earth's new and improved moon viewing software. UFO hunter Marcelo Irasuta from Argentina was the one who scoured the surface looking for anomalies. Then he found what unmistakably looks like a pyramid. He uploaded his video online, and now people are calling out NASA for being liars. Hardcore believers are saying NASA has been covering up the existence of alien life and the ruins of lost civilizations on the moon. But what's the truth here? Unfortunately, it's really difficult to say. We can't go to the moon and check to see if the pyramid is artificial or simply a triangular-shaped rock. But there have been some interesting theories about the moon for a very long time. In 1970, Russian scientists Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov suggested the moon may itself have been made by alien intelligence. If such a thing were true, it wouldn't be that difficult to believe that somewhere on the moon is an old base or a city, one abandoned by aliens thousands of years ago. Neolithic axe grinding. Archaeologists recently discovered an ancient Neolithic grinding site used by Neolithic toolmakers to sharpen their knives and stone axes. The site, discovered near Balfron in the UK, was used 4,500 years ago. It's a giant whetstone, just like your whetstone that you use to sharpen your kitchen knives. Only this one is massive and stuck in the ground. A giant piece of sandstone with markings left behind by polished axes. The shocking discovery was made by a group of local archaeologists and volunteers. They identified 33 grooves on the huge piece of sandstone. The grooves were made by axes as they were smoothed or sharpened to perfection. Even more interesting is that the experts believe people may have traveled many miles just to use the local whetstone. It may have had religious significance, or it might have just been a kind of gathering place for hunters to discuss local news. It would have been like the local farmers meeting at a pub, only it was hunters meeting at the axe sharpening site, a medieval pantry. In 1495, King Hans of Denmark anchored his ship off the coast of Sweden. While he briefly went on land, his ship caught fire and sank. The ship, named the Griffin, spontaneously combusted and then sank to the floor of the Baltic Sea. It was a pretty big disaster for the king, who was on his way to Kalmar, where he hoped to be elected King of Sweden. This would unite the entire Nordic region under one man. As part of his plan to be accepted as the king, Hans was bringing treats and treasures for those he needed to convince. His ship was filled with the best foods and spices available at the time. All of these gifts that were supposed to persuade Swedish leadership were now under a significant amount of water. They remained underwater for 5 centuries, until archaeologists finally uncovered them. Experts discovered the ruins of the ship deep in the Baltic Sea. Inside the wreckage, divers found the spices and food prepared by King Hans still in the pantry. This was almost definitely the most fully stocked medieval pantry anyone has ever laid eyes on. It contained over 40 different types of fruits, spices, cereals, nuts, and so much more. Brendan Foley from Lund University in Sweden called it a substantially complete royal medieval pantry. Even though King Hans' ship sank, he still became king of Sweden. He was king for less than half a decade, and in 1501 he was kicked out. He would spend the rest of his life until 1513 ruling Denmark and Norway. Civil War musket balls. Archaeologists with the UK's HS2 high-speed rail project were digging at an ancient estate in Warwickshire when they made an amazing discovery. The estate is called Coleshill Manor, and it was involved in hostilities during the English Civil War of the 17th century. Researchers found evidence of the ancient armed conflict in the form of musket balls. They found the impact marks of over 200 musket balls, with the balls being concentrated around the heavily fortified gatehouse. The gatehouse, although it took musket fire in the 17th century, was constructed over 700 years ago. It was originally built in the medieval days as a fortified entrance to the manor, keeping out the riffraff. Just under 400 years ago, the estate was likely a royalist stronghold. It was here where some of the fanciest nobles in England hid from the parliamentarians. Researchers think that as the parliamentarian troops marched to confront the armies of the royalists, they attacked Coleshill Manor just for the sake of it. It may have been the first armed conflict of the war, which lasted between 1642 and 1651. As the troops were going by, they unloaded pistols and muskets at whoever was taking shelter in the luxurious estate. However, we don't know if there was any real skirmish or if anyone died. No bodies have been found, and there are no records talking about any fighting at Coleshill Manor. All we know for sure is that the gatehouse and exterior walls took a serious pounding from some very heavy gunfire. The mysterious Planet 9. The elusive Planet 9 is supposedly hiding at the outer reaches of our solar system. The planet has never been officially confirmed as real, but according to numerous theories, it exists just beyond the orbit of Neptune. Scientists proposed its existence in 2016 when they published a study in the Astronomical Journal. The planet has been used as a hypothetical explanation for the bizarre orbits of objects around Neptune. Asteroids, comets, and other small celestial objects appear to be rotating around something very unusual that scientists can't physically see. The theory is that there is a planet hidden from our view, something 5 or 10 times larger than our own planet. It also orbits the Sun from around 250 times farther than Earth. If it's not a planet, some scientists have suggested it could be a small black hole. I don't think I need to tell you what the danger of a black hole in our solar system means for the human race. Scientists are fairly confident that we won't be swallowed into a black hole anytime soon, but there could still be a planet out there. A new study suggests Planet 9, which some say could be home to aliens, is shielded from our view by a swarm of tiny moons. Rock-cut tombs in Egypt. Archaeologists in Egypt accidentally found a series of mysterious rock-cut tombs. They found over 250 ancient tombs cut into the side of a mountain, with many of them dating back 4,200 years. You might be wondering how such a discovery could be made by accident. According to the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, it all happened during an archaeological survey. It wasn't like a donkey stumbled upon them. It was still archaeologists who made the discovery, but they hadn't been looking for the tombs. They were investigating the Al-Hamidiyya necropolis near Sohag when they found hundreds of niches and chambers carved by hand into the side of the mountain. The graves date from between 2200 BC and 30 BC, from ancient Egypt to the death of Cleopatra, Egypt's last pharaoh. Unfortunately, there don't appear to be any mummies. Whoever was buried inside these tombs were taken from their final resting places long ago, probably by grave robbers. Still, some of the tombs are impressive. There are doors inscribed with hieroglyphics, sloping passages leading into deep underground chambers. Historians believe the tombs were allocated for the common people. They were just ordinary graves for ordinary folk, people who couldn't afford things like mummification, or to have their brains pulled out through their noses. A hole in the skull. 3,500 years ago in Israel, a pair of brothers came down with a serious illness. These brothers lived in an upper-class family, meaning they had access to all the best doctors of the day. To fix their injuries, these brothers had to undergo some serious surgical operations. One of them underwent a radical procedure known as trephination, meaning he had a square hole removed from his skull. Evidence of the brothers was discovered at the remote archaeological site of Megiddo in northern Israel. This is a place in the middle of the desert, not somewhere you'd want to take a leisurely stroll. The bones found at the site now appear to be the oldest evidence of such a surgery being practiced in the area. Older evidence of trephination has been found in France, going back 6,500 years. For some bizarre reason, prehistoric doctors had a fascination with cutting holes in skulls. Rachel Kalisher with Brown University says there have been about a dozen ancient skulls found in the Middle East with trephination holes. The brothers lived between about 1550 and 1450 BC. They were discovered buried underneath the ruins of a house in a wealthy part of the city. One brother had his skull perfectly intact, but died in his early 20s. The second brother lived a little longer, though not because he went through with the procedure. There was no evidence of healing, meaning he likely died after the operation. Considering the doctor would have been using primitive stone or bronze tools, attempting brain surgery was wildly ambitious. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Jessica Kovacs and Patrick Nicias for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about mysterious discoveries. Taos Pueblo. Taos Pueblo is an ancient town about a mile from the city of Taos, New Mexico. And even though it's only a mile from a city, it's still essentially in the middle of nowhere. It was definitely in the middle of nowhere 1,000 years ago, when the town was inhabited by the Tewa Native American tribe. To this day, it's one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in the U.S., with its residents still speaking the Taos language of their ancestors. As of 2010, there were roughly 150 permanent residents living inside the historical pueblo. But let's take a deeper look at the history of the place. The Taos indigenous people likely settled here starting around the year 1000, but by the year 1300, drought had moved into the area. Like so many of the other groups living in New Mexico, the citizens of Taos Pueblo packed up and left. Their dwellings were abandoned as they went searching for a stable water supply. However, the exact reason for their departure is still up for debate. There has been evidence of a massive violent struggle that took place here, suggesting it may have been conflict that drove the original inhabitants to leave. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1540, the ruins of Taos Pueblo were found. Though to be certain, it's unclear when people had begun to return following their original departure. The Spanish took an interest in the city themselves and moved in. In 1620, Spanish Jesuits constructed a Catholic church. There were some major cultural tensions, though, and in 1660 the natives rioted, killed the priest, and burned down the church. Have you ever been to Taos? Do you recommend it? Let us all know in the comments below. Lassiter's Reef. In 1929, Harold Bell Lassiter made a bold claim. He said that he discovered a rich gold deposit in a remote and desolate part of Central Australia. In October of that same year, he wrote a letter to Australian authorities claiming he found a vast gold reef near the edge of the McDonnell Ranges and needed help finding it. Despite his claim, the government ignored him. Nobody made any effort to go out into the inhospitable wasteland and search for the gold deposit Harold had supposedly found. In March of 1930, Harold reached out to the Australian Workers' Union. Yet again, he was painfully ignored. He didn't have enough money, but desperately wanted to secure the gold he believed was out there waiting for him. Luckily for Harold, the 1930s brought the Great Depression. There was a much greater interest in Australian gold mining. He managed to secure a massive amount of money from a private donor for an expedition to relocate the gold reef. The group left from Alice Springs with motorized vehicles in March of 1930, but things started to go wrong right away. Harold proved to be a miserable guide. He took them on a wild goose chase, and the leader of the expedition grew tired of it. He called Harold a nut job and ended the mission. But Harold continued on his own with a pair of camels. Long story short, Harold's body was found in the desert in March of 1931. He died from malnutrition, still hunting for the gold that has yet to ever be found. Do you think Lassiter's Golden Reef is a real place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Odeon of Crete. Archaeologists on the island of Crete in Greece have discovered something amazing. A very rare ancient Odeon was found in the remote wilderness of the island. An Odeon is an ancient structure used by Greeks and Romans, usually for musical performances. The Roman Odeon was used roughly 2,000 years ago for everything from public lectures to city council meetings. It may even have been used for things like musical contests, which would have brought the whole community out to celebrate. The ruin was found near the ancient lost city of Lissos, hidden deep in Crete's mountains. The archaeological remains here can only be seen by those willing to hike through the rough terrain to reach them. Most of Lissos has been ignored by archaeologists because it's too annoying to get to. But a recent group of stout-hearted researchers decided to take the extra time and complete some excavations. This impressive Odeon was one of their biggest discoveries. If you're still not sure what an Odeon was, just imagine an amphitheater built on the side of a mountain and open to the fresh air. It was an outdoor auditorium, and its presence here in Lissos means the city was once far more important than anyone imagined. For there to be such a large auditorium in the town, it must have been prosperous. We already know it was inhabited since at least the 4th century BC, right across the Mediterranean Sea from Libya. Lissos had to be an important stop on naval trading routes across the Mediterranean. Archaeologists even found a temple here dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. Ancient Viking treasure. A gold disc was recently uncovered in Denmark that appears to boast the oldest known mention of everyone's favorite Norse god king, Odin. The inscription on the mysterious gold disc mentions Odin by name 150 years before anything else. The gold disc, known as a bracteate, was crafted around the 5th century AD. Up until now, the oldest mention of Odin was found on a brooch excavated from Germany that came from the latter part of the 6th century. Assistant Professor Simon Nygaard from Aarhus University says the artifact is now the smoking gun that proves Odin existed in Scandinavia at least as early as 1,600 years ago. But what's the significance of all this? First of all, Odin is the main god of Norse mythology. Thor might be more popular these days, but Thor never eclipsed Odin in the original belief system. When the rest of Europe was focused on Christianity and Judaism, Scandinavia still held strong to their beliefs in Norse lore. The Vikings kept their beliefs going until they eventually succumbed to Christianity 1,000 years ago. What nobody's ever known is when exactly Norse mythology began to take shape. It likely came before Christianity, but it's tough to find evidence of. That's what makes the gold disc, uncovered in a remote treasure hoard, so remarkable. It's physical evidence that Odin was worshipped in Denmark starting in the 5th century. But we still don't know where Odin came from originally, or how long he'd already been worshipped. Ancient horse riders. Humans may have been riding horses for the past 5,000 years. A grave that was recently discovered in the remote Bulgarian countryside contains the remains of what could be the earliest horseback riders ever. Scientists have always wondered when human beings started riding horses. Technically, horses were the first vehicles we used to move across the land faster. Now, researchers with the University of Helsinki have dug up evidence of humans riding horses 5 millennia ago. This is shocking because it would predate the oldest unequivocal evidence for domesticated horses by about 1,000 years. Researchers have already found horses buried with chariots in the remote Russian wilderness. Other studies have proved that horses lived with humans, whether they were ridden or not, in Kazakhstan at least 5,500 years ago. Scientists looked at the human remains of 156 dead people throughout 39 burial sites in the Eurasian steppes. This is the area where some of the earliest horseback riders flourished. Scientists looked specifically for traits in the bones that may have been a result of frequent horseback riding. Specifically, they looked at the muscle attachment site on pelvis and thigh bones. What they discovered was that the ancient riders were the people of the Yamnaya culture who lived in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. Remains taken from graves in remote Bulgaria proved the oldest, dating back to 3000 BC, the Nesscliffe Hill Fort. Hidden in the English countryside is a place called the Nesscliffe Hill Fort. It was recently excavated by archaeologists from the University of Oxford, who uncovered the massive remains of an Iron Age hill fort. This place is so old, experts haven't found any organic matter to shed light on what life was like here. They didn't find any pieces of wood, any fabrics, or even any shards of pottery. All they know is that there was once a huge defensive edifice in the middle of absolutely nowhere in the Severn Valley. The few fragments of stone discovered have been dated back to about 600 BC. This fortress stood tall and proud over 600 years before the Romans invaded England and started building their own fortifications. In 2022, the team revealed the front facade of a rampart. They found tool markings made 2,500 years ago and unearthed the remains of a ditch that might have been a kind of prehistoric moat. Gary Locke, a professor from the university and lead scientist on the project, says everyone's been surprised by how huge the fortress was in its prime. This thing was built during a time when Britain was largely occupied by humble farmers, and yet some group went through the trouble of building a massive tower of stone. But Gary doesn't know who built the tower or why. We don't even know how these people socially organized themselves. This is prehistoric archaeology, meaning we are looking at people who had no written records and lived in tribes ruled by chiefs and elders. Gary says they were most likely a superstitious people, a group that had their own unique gods and deities. Medieval Spanish fortress. An ancient fortress town was discovered on a remote hilltop in Spain. It was found in Galicia in 1865 by archaeologist Manuel Murgia. He believed the fortress town was built during the Iron Age, making it at least 3,500 years old. The settlement at the top of the hill in the middle of nowhere maintained its reputation as an Iron Age site up until recently, when researchers took a new look at it. Scientists from the University of Santiago de Compostela found evidence that the settlement, named Castro Valente, is in fact from the medieval period. It was most likely built only about 1,400 years ago in the 7th century AD. It's about 2,000 years younger than previously believed. It's pretty rare for archaeologists to make such a gruesome mistake when dating an ancient place. This was a particularly egregious mistake because it took over a century to fix. Archaeologists only corrected the historical record by accident when they employed new LiDAR technology. The researchers used a system of laser beams attached to an aerial platform to create a three-dimensional image of the site. They were able to map the entire area using this new technology, getting an unprecedented look at the remains of the fortress town. They identified over 30 stone towers that once protected a massive settlement. There were heavy walls and reinforced protective barriers. What really shocked experts was that the 3D image of the fortified town looked suspiciously like a medieval fortress. That was when they realized the site is significantly younger than previously believed. They are quite literally rewriting history here and now have a massive mystery to solve. Archaeologists want to understand who built the fortress, who lived in it, and where they went. The wheel. In the remote British countryside, a wheel was discovered. Not just any ordinary wheel, one from the Bronze Age. It could be the biggest and earliest wooden wheel ever found in Britain. It was discovered buried under the soil at an ancient place dubbed Britain's Pompeii. Archaeologists are calling the 3,000-year-old artifact unprecedented. The wheel is about 3 feet in diameter and still attached to its hub. It appears to have been burned, but not much more is known yet. It was discovered at an ancient farming site, a place that was occupied at the end of the Bronze Age from 1100 to 800 BC. There was likely a small group of families living here, with maybe 4 or 5 large round houses built on stilts above the shallow water. The wheel was found near the remains of the biggest house, so it's believed it belonged to the most important family. It's not clear what the wooden wheel was used for. It could have been part of a horse-drawn cart, but there is no way of saying for sure. Archaeologists think the wheel suffered burn damage when the whole settlement was eradicated in a fire. Thanks for watching! Which discovery did you like the most? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!